The check from the bank was stamped with a single word in bright red ink. Insufficient. James Harper stared at it, hands trembling, as the dust from the long summer drought settled on his kitchen table. Outside his window, a sleek black SUV had pulled over, a family looking tired and lost. Little did he know that in just 10 minutes, his simple act of sharing the last of his harvest would catch the attention of tech billionaire Alexandra Chen, who was about to change his life with a single question. What would you do if someone invested $1 million in this farm? Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The summer heat pressed down like a physical weight on Oakidge farm. James Harper wiped sweat from his brow with a bandana that had once been red, but had faded to a dusty pink after countless washings. The cracked earth beneath his boots told a story of 3 years of drought, of prayers for rain that went unanswered, of a once thriving family farm now hanging by a thread. At 42, James's face was weathered beyond his years, lines etched deep by sun and worry. His shoulders, once proudly squared against any challenge, now carried the invisible weight of mounting debts and dwindling crops. The farm had been in the Harper family for 4 generations, passed down from father to son with pride and purpose. Now it seemed James might be the one to lose it all. He walked between rows of struggling corn, touching the leaves that should have been tall and green, but instead were stunted and yellowing. The irrigation system he'd invested in last year, money he couldn't afford but had borrowed anyway, was keeping some crops alive, but barely. The well was dropping, and water restrictions meant he couldn't pump what he needed. Just another month, he whispered to himself. Just hold on another month. His phone buzzed in his pocket. James ignored it, knowing it would be another creditor, another bill, another voice asking for money he didn't have. Instead, he focused on the few vegetables that were thriving despite the odds: the hardy tomatoes, the stubborn peppers, the resilient squash. These he would take to the local farmer's market tomorrow, though the prices they'd fetch would barely cover the gas to get there. When he finally reached the edge of his property, James paused, shading his eyes against the relentless sun. His farm bordered a county road, rarely traveled except by locals. But today, a vehicle was pulled over on the shoulder of a black SUV with tinted windows, clearly not from around here. Even from this distance, he could see a woman and 2 children standing beside it, looking hot and uncomfortable. James hesitated. He had work to do, problems of his own that needed solving. But something about the family's posture, the slumped shoulders, the way the mother kept glancing at her children with concern, tugged at him. Before he could talk himself out of it, he was heading back to the farmhouse to fill a cooler with water bottles and gather some of his precious produce. 10 minutes later, James approached the stranded family, pulling a small wagon loaded with his offerings. Up close, he could see they were dressed in clothes that seemed too formal for the country. Heat the mother in a silk blouse, now wrinkled with sweat, the children in what looked like private school uniforms, and a man who must be the father speaking tensely into a cell phone. "Excuse me," James called, lifting his hand in greeting. "You folks look like you could use some refreshment." The family turned, surprise evident on their faces. The woman, slender, with intelligent eyes and an elegant bearing, despite her obvious discomfort, stepped forward. "Oh," she said, clearly taken aback by his approach. "That's very kind of you, Alexandra," the man said, covering his phone briefly. "I can't get any service out here. The GPS took us on some kind of shortcut, and now we're completely lost." James offered a sympathetic smile. "Cell coverage is spotty out here. Where are you folks trying to get to?" "We were heading to Lancaster," the woman, Alexandra, explained. "We have a meeting there this afternoon." James nodded. Lancaster was a good hour away, and they were definitely not on the most direct route. "You're about 30 miles off course. This road eventually connects with Highway 16, but it's a winding path." The man cursed under his breath, and James noticed the children, a boy of about 12 and a girl perhaps 10, exchange worried glances. "We're going to be late, David," Alexandra said to her husband. Then, turning to James, "Is there a faster way back to the main highway?" "There's a county road about 5 miles ahead that cuts across to Highway 16, James explained. "It'll save you some time." But first, he gestured to his wagon. You all look overheated. I brought some cold water and fresh vegetables from my farm. Please, help yourselves. The children's eyes widened at the sight of the colorful produce, vibrant red tomatoes, glossy purple eggplants, yellow squash, and green peppers. James had also packed some peaches from his small orchard, their fuzzy skin blushing orange and pink. Alexandra seemed hesitant. That's incredibly generous. But we couldn't possibly, please, James insisted. I've got plenty. It was a lie, but one told out of genuine concern. And it's too hot to be out here without proper hydration. David had ended his call and approached, eyeing James with a mixture of gratitude and assessment. Thank you, Mr. Harper. James Harper. This is my farm you're stopped alongside. David Chen, the man said, extending his hand. His grip was firm. His palm smoothed the hand of someone who worked with his mind, not his body. This is my wife, Alexandra, and our children, Lucas and May. James shook hands with David, nodding politely to the others. Pleasure to meet you all. Now, please, take some water at least. He distributed cold bottles, watching as the family drank gratefully. The children were eyeing the peaches with particular interest. Go ahead, James encouraged them. They're perfectly ripe today. May, the younger child, looked to her mother for permission. At Alexandra's nod, both children selected peaches, biting into them with obvious delight. Oh my goodness! Lucas exclaimed, juice running down his chin. This is amazing! Mom, you have to try one. Alexandra accepted a peach somewhat reluctantly, but her expression changed to surprise after the first bite. This is incredible. I don't think I've tasted a peach this good since I was a child visiting my grandparents' farm in California. Nothing beats tree-ripened fruit, James said, feeling a flush of pride despite himself. Commercial peaches are picked hard so they can be shipped, but they never develop the same sweetness. David was examining the other produce with interest. You grew all this yourself? Yes, sir. Oakidge farm been in my family since my great-grandfather's time. David nodded, seemingly impressed. Farming must be challenging in this drought. James's smile tightened slightly. We manage. Some seasons are better than others. How many acres do you farm? David asked, his tone casual, but his eyes sharp. About 200, though only about half is under cultivation this year, due to the water restrictions. James wasn't sure why he was sharing these details with strangers, but something about David's interest seemed genuine. Alexandra had been watching this exchange thoughtfully. She selected a tomato from the wagon. May I? At James's nod, she bit into it like it was an apple, closing her eyes momentarily at the flavor. Extraordinary. Is it a special variety? Cherokee purple, James said. An heirloom tomato. Not as pretty as the commercial ones, but the taste is worth it. I'd take flavor over appearance any day, Alexandra said, wiping juice from her chin with a tissue from her purse. Do you sell these at markets? When I can. Mostly local farmers markets, a few restaurants in Lancaster that appreciate heirloom varieties. David had taken out his phone again, but instead of trying to make calls, he was now taking photos of the produce. This is the kind of quality we've been talking about, Alex, he said to his wife. Remember what Chef Martin was saying? Alexandra nodded, a thoughtful expression on her face. She turned to James. Mr. Harper, I hope you don't mind my asking, but have you ever considered expanding your heirloom produce operation? There's a growing market for authentically grown, flavorful food. James couldn't help the short laugh that escaped him. Expansion requires capital, Mrs. Chen, and banks aren't exactly lining up to loan money to small farmers these days, especially with the drought. She nodded, her expression sympathetic but not pitying. James appreciated that. Of course, I didn't mean to presume. She paused, then reached into her purse and extracted a business card, offering it to him. But if you ever want to discuss possibilities, please feel free to contact me. James accepted the card automatically, glancing down at it. Chen Innovations. It read, with Alexandra's name and the title Co-founder CEO. Below that was a San Francisco address and contact information. "You're quite away from San Francisco," he observed. David smiled. "We're on what you might call a working vacation. Alexandra and I like to explore different regions, meet interesting people, and eat delicious food," Lucas added with a grin, reaching for another peach. James handed the boy the fruit, his mind working to reconcile these polished urbanites with their apparent interest in his humble produce. "Well, I'm glad you enjoyed a taste of Oakidge Farm. Now, about getting you back on track to Lancaster." He pulled out his phone and showed them the route on a map app, giving detailed directions about landmarks to watch for, since GPS was unreliable in these parts. "Thank you so much, Mr. Harper," Alexandra said warmly. "You've been incredibly kind. Please, let us compensate you for the produce." She was already reaching for her wallet, but James shook his head firmly. "Not necessary. Consider it country hospitality." "At least let us," David began, but James cut him off with a gentle smile. "Truly, I'm happy to help. Just pay it forward Sunday." Alexandra studied him for a moment, then nodded. "We certainly will. Thank you for your generosity." As the family packed up to leave, May approached James shyly, holding out a small origami crane she had apparently folded from a piece of paper while they talked. "This is for you," she said softly. "For the peaches." James accepted the delicate creation with exaggerated care. "Why, thank you, Miss May. This is beautiful. I'll keep it on my windowsill." The girl beamed, then scampered back to the SUV. The Chens waved as they pulled away, and James stood watching until their vehicle disappeared around a bend in the road. Only then did he look down at Alexandra's business card again. Chen Innovations. The name meant nothing to him, but then, he was hardly plugged into the world of tech startups, or whatever their company might be. Still, there had been something in the way they'd looked at his produce, something in their questions. James shook his head, pocketing the card. Nice people, but worlds apart from his reality. He turned back toward his fields, the weight of his problems settling once more on his shoulders. The brief respite of the encounter faded as he took stock of the work still waiting for him: irrigation lines to check, a tractor that needed repair, and somehow, somewhere, a way to find the money for next season's seed. If he even had a next season. The afternoon stretched into evening as James worked, methodically checking each irrigation line for leaks or clogs. Water was too precious to waste even a drop. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, he finally headed back to the farmhouse, his body aching with the day's labor. The two-story white clapboard structure had seen better days. Paint peeled from the trim, and one of the porch steps creaked dangerously. Inside was little better furniture that had been old when James inherited it, appliances that wheezed and groaned but somehow kept working. Like the farm itself, the house was worn but dignified, bearing its age and hardships with quiet grace. James showered away the day's dust and sweat, then heated a simple dinner of beans and rice with some of his own peppers and tomatoes mixed in. As he ate at the kitchen table, he found himself thinking again about the Chen family. They seemed nice, enough polite, appreciative of his produce in a way that felt genuine. The children had good manners too, which James always took as a sign of proper parenting. He wondered idly what Chen Innovations actually did. Some tech company most likely, given the San Francisco address. James's relationship with technology was purely practical. A smartphone for weather forecasts and market prices, a laptop for farm records, and occasional research on crop diseases or new growing methods. He had no social media accounts, no interest in the latest apps or gadgets that city folks seemed to revolve their lives around. After dinner, he settled on the porch with a glass of iced tea, watching as fireflies began to blink in the gathering darkness. This was his favorite time of day, the brief window when the heat relented and a sense of peace descended. For a few minutes, he could almost forget the precarious state of his finances, the looming threat of foreclosure. The origami crane that May had given him sat on the porch railing, and James found himself smiling at the memory of the shy child. Strange, how a brief encounter with strangers could linger in the mind. Perhaps it was simply the novelty visitors were rare out here, especially ones who showed genuine interest in his farming methods. As darkness fell completely, James reluctantly went back inside, setting the crane carefully on his windowsill as promised. Tomorrow would bring the farmer's market, an early start, and a long day of hoping to make just enough sales to justify the trip. He checked his phone one last time, a missed call from the bank. No voicemail, and then went to bed, falling into an exhausted sleep almost immediately. The farmer's market in Riverdale, the nearest town of any size, was already bustling when James arrived at 6 the next morning. He set up his modest stand, arranging his produce with care despite his fatigue. The night had brought troubled dreams, visions of withered crops and bankers with foreclosure notices, interspersed with oddly vivid images of the Chen family somehow working alongside him in the fields. "Morning, James," called Eliza Johnson, who ran the honey stand adjacent to his. A widow in her 60s, Eliza had been coming to this market for decades, her wildflower honey a local legend. "You're looking more worn out than usual, if that's possible." James managed to smile. "Good morning to you too, Eliza. Always a pleasure to receive your compliments on my appearance." She cackled, arranging jars of golden honey on her table. "Just calling it like I see it. How are things out at Oakidge?" "Oh, you know, hanging in there." It was his standard response, revealing nothing of the true direness of his situation. Eliza nodded, but her eyes were shrewd. Heard Westland Farm finally sold to those developers. Going to be one of those luxury rural communities or some such nonsense. James felt a pang. The Westlands had been farming that land for as long as the Harpers had been at Oakidge. But Bill Westland was in his 70s, with no children interested in taking over. James could hardly blame him for selling, especially for the kind of money developers were offering. "Times change," he said quietly. "Too much if you ask me," Eliza replied. "Soon there won't be a working farm left in the county, just hobby plots for rich city folks playing at being farmers on weekends." James said nothing. He'd been approached by developers too, offering what seemed like a fortune for his land. The temptation had been strong. The money would solve all his immediate problems, set him up comfortably. But what would he do afterward? Farming was all he knew, all he wanted to know. And the thought of Oakidge being carved up into 5-acre gentleman farms made his stomach turn. The market opened officially at 7, and customers began to trickle in. James made small talk, explained the virtues of heirloom varieties to those who asked, and gradually watched his inventory dwindle. By noon, he'd sold about 3/4 of what he'd brought, not a sellout, but better than some days. He was wrapping up a sale of peppers and eggplant to a regular customer when a voice behind him said, "I was hoping we'd find you here." James turned to find Alexandra Chen standing there, without her family this time, looking remarkably different from the day before. Gone was the wilted silk blouse, replaced by a simple linen shirt and jeans. Her hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and she wore minimal makeup. She looked younger, more approachable, though no less elegant. "Mrs. Chen?" James said, surprised. "I didn't expect to see you again." She smiled. "Please, call me Alexandra. And I'm sorry to surprise you, but after tasting your produce yesterday, I couldn't resist coming to see what else you grow." She gestured to his nearly empty table. "Though it seems I'm a bit late. The market closes at 2, but most of the best stuff goes early," James explained. "You're still in the area? I thought you had a meeting in Lancaster yesterday." "We did, but we decided to stay in the region a bit longer." She picked up one of his remaining tomatoes, examining it. "This is beautiful. Do you grow other heirloom varieties besides the Cherokee Purple?" "Several. Brandywine, Black Crim, Green Zebra, Yellow Pear. I like experimenting with different types." "Oh?" Alexandra nodded, her interest seeming genuine. "And your peaches yesterday were exceptional. Do you grow other tree fruits?" "Some apples, pears, a few plum trees. Nothing commercial scale, just enough for local sales and my own use." And she set down the tomato and looked directly at him. "Mr. Harper." "James, please." "James, I'd like to talk with you about your farm, if you'd be willing. Perhaps you have time for coffee after the market closes?" James studied her, puzzled by her interest but intrigued despite himself. I should get back to check on my irrigation system. It won't take long, she promised. And it could be worth your while. Something in her tone caught his attention. This wasn't mere politeness. She had an agenda. What is this about exactly? Alexandra glanced around at the busy market, then back to him. My husband and I are looking for partners in a new venture. Your farm, what we've seen of it, has potential that aligns with our vision. I'd like to discuss possibilities, that's all. James hesitated. He had work waiting at home, and he'd learned to be wary of opportunities that sounded too good to be true. But curiosity won out. All right, there's a cafe just down the street that stays open late. We can talk there after I pack up. Perfect. Alexandra smiled, a brief but genuine expression that transformed her serious face. I'll let you get back to your customers. See you at 2. She moved away, browsing other stalls, occasionally making purchases. James watched her surreptitiously as he continued with his own sales. There was something about her manner confident, without being arrogant, observant, thoughtful that intrigued him. What could a tech executive possibly want with his struggling farm? At 2 o'clock, James packed his remaining produce, just a few items now, into his coolers and loaded them into his truck. Alexandra appeared as he was securing the tailgate. Ready? She asked. He nodded, still not entirely sure what he was getting himself into. Cafes this way. They walked together down Main Street, a short stretch of storefronts that constituted downtown Riverdale. The cafe, Beans Books, was a local institution, part coffee shop, part used bookstore, all small-town charm. I like this place already, Alexandra commented as they entered. The scent of coffee and old books created a welcoming atmosphere, and a few locals looked up briefly from their conversations or reading. They ordered black coffee for James, a latte for Alexandra, and settled at a corner table with good privacy. So, James said after they'd both taken preliminary sips, what's this all about? What vision does Chen Innovations have that involves a small farm in the middle of nowhere? Alexandra set down her cup. Let me tell you a bit about us first. Chen Innovations isn't just a tech company, though that's how we started. My husband David built a successful software platform that we sold 5 years ago. Since then, we've been investing in ventures that promote sustainability, community resilience, and ethical business practices. James nodded slowly. Sounds commendable, but I'm still not seeing the connection to Oakidge Farm. One of our current projects is a farm-to-table ecosystem that connects exceptional small producers directly with high-end restaurants and conscientious consumers. We're building a network of farms that grow heirloom varieties and practice sustainable agriculture, linked through a distribution and marketing system that ensures fair prices for farmers and availability of truly exceptional food for buyers. End quote. James sat back, considering this. There are already CSAs and farmers markets for that. Yes, but they're fragmented, limited in reach, and often don't provide enough consistent income for farmers to thrive, Alexandra explained. We're aiming for something more integrated and supportive. Think of it as infrastructure that allows small farms to compete effectively with industrial agriculture, but without compromising on quality or BAS. Sustainability. And you think Oakidge could be part of this network? James asked, skepticism evident in his tone. Based on what we've seen and tasted, absolutely. Your produce is exceptional, James. But more importantly, you clearly care about what you grow and how you grow it. That's the foundation we're looking for. James took a long sip of his coffee. I appreciate the compliment, but my farm is hardly a showcase right now. The drought has hit us hard, and frankly, I'm struggling just to keep the place afloat. Alexandra nodded, her expression serious. I suspected as much. Many small farms are in similar positions. That's partly why we're building this network, to provide more stability and better returns for farmers doing quality work. And what exactly would this partnership entail? James asked, his practical nature asserting itself. Investment in your farm, in exchange for a commitment to grow certain crops to our specifications, and to sell a portion of your harvest through our network. We provide capital for improvements, technical support where needed, and guaranteed purchase agreements at prices that reflect the true value of your product." End quote. James's mind was racing. It sounded too good to be true, which usually meant it was. And what would you get out of this? A percentage of the sales through our platform, of course. But more importantly, another node in our network of exceptional producers. This isn't charity, James. It's a business proposition that we believe benefits everyone involved: farmers, consumers, restaurants, and yes, our company too. Why me? Why Oakidge? You must have visited dozens of farms in your travels. Alexandra smiled slightly. We have, but not many farmers would stop what they're doing to help a stranded family with no expectation of payment or recognition. Character matters to us as much as growing practices. Plus, she added with a touch of humor, those peaches really were extraordinary. Despite himself, James felt a flush of pride. They are good, aren't they? The best I've had. And I'm guessing they're not even your main crop. No, just a small orchard. The vegetables are my primary focus. Alexandra reached into her bag and pulled out a tablet. I'd like to show you something if I may. James nodded, and she turned the screen toward him. On it was a website showing beautiful photography of farms, produce, and people, farmers standing proudly in their fields, chefs creating elaborate dishes, families enjoying meals. This is our current network, Alexandra explained, scrolling through the pages. 12 farms across California, Oregon, and Washington, each specializing in what they grow best, each maintaining their individual identity while benefiting from being part of something larger. James scanned the images, impressed, despite his skepticism. The farms looked prosperous, the farmers happy. And you want Oakidge to be lucky number 13? If it's a good fit for both of us, Alexandra confirmed. We don't rush these decisions. I'd like to see more of your farm, understand your operation better. And you should talk to some of our current partners, hear their experiences firsthand. But based on what little I've seen, so far, I'm optimistic. James ran a hand through his hair, a habit when he was thinking deeply. This is unexpected. I'll need time to consider. Of course, this isn't a decision to make lightly, Alexandra agreed. Why don't we do this? My family and I are staying in Lancaster for the next few days. Could we visit your farm tomorrow for a proper tour? No pressure, just a chance for us to learn more and for you to ask questions. James hesitated only briefly. What did he have to lose? All right. Tomorrow afternoon would work. Say around 2? Perfect. Alexandra extended her hand across the table. Thank you for being open to the possibility, James. Whatever you ultimately decide, I'm glad we had this conversation. He shook her hand, noting the surprising strength in her grip. I'm still not sure what to make of all this, but I'm willing to listen. As they parted outside the cafe, James found himself in a state of cautious optimism that he hadn't felt in years. He'd been approached with schemes before, developers wanting his land, corporations offering contract farming arrangements that would essentially make him an employee on his own property. But this felt different. Alexandra Chen seemed sincere, and her vision aligned with values he already held. Still, he reminded himself as he drove back to Oakidge, appearances could be deceiving. City folks often had romantic notions about farming that didn't align with reality. He would reserve judgment until he'd heard more details and, as Alexandra had suggested, spoken with some of their existing partners. For now, though, he had a farm to tend and preparations to make for tomorrow's visit. Whatever came of the Chen's interest, Oakidge would put its best foot forward. The next morning, James woke before dawn as usual, but with an unusual sense of purpose. After completing his essential morning tasks, checking irrigation, tending to the small flock of chickens he kept for eggs, inspecting a row of seedlings in the greenhouse, he turned his attention to preparing for the Chen's copper visit. He wasn't trying to create a false impression. Rather, he wanted to ensure they saw the potential of Oakidge beneath its current struggles. He cleared debris from the main barn, swept the farmhouse porch, and even put on a clean shirt free of soil stains, a rarity during growing season. As he worked, his mind kept returning to his conversation with Alexandra. Her proposal seemed aligned with what he'd always wanted for Oakidge Farm, that produced exceptional food sustainably and profitably. The profitably part had proven elusive these past few years, but the quality had never wavered. He refused to compromise on growing methods, even when financial pressure tempted him toward shortcuts. At precisely 2 o'clock, a now familiar black SUV pulled into the driveway. All 4 Chens emerged, dressed more casually than during their roadside encounter. David wore khakis and a polo shirt, Alexandra jeans and a light sweater despite the heat, and the children had exchanged their uniforms for typical kids' summer wear: shorts, t-shirts, and sturdy shoes. "Welcome to Oakidge," James called, walking down from the porch to greet them. Officially this time. David shook his hand warmly. "Thanks for having us, James. We've been looking forward to this." "Mr. Harper," May exclaimed, beaming, "I see my crane on your windowsill." James smiled at the child's delight. "Indeed you do. It's right where I promised it would be." Lucas was already gazing around with evident curiosity. "Your farm is huge. Do you take care of all this by yourself?" "Mostly," James acknowledged. "I hire seasonal help for harvest time, and my neighbor's son comes over a few days a week to help with heavier tasks. But day to day, it's just me." Alexandra was studying the farmhouse with interest. "How long has your family owned this property?" "Since 1896, James said with a touch of pride. "My great-grandfather bought it when this was all open rangeland. Each generation has added something: the orchard, the greenhouse, the irrigation system. Not always easy, but always worth it." "That's quite a legacy," David remarked. "You must feel a strong connection to this place." James nodded, suddenly conscious of an emotion he typically kept buried. "It's more than land to me. It's home, in the deepest sense." A brief silence followed, broken by Lucas's eager question, "Can we see where the vegetables grow?" James smiled at the boy's enthusiasm. "Absolutely. Let's start with the main fields, then work our way around to the orchard and greenhouse." For the next 2 hours, James led the Chen family on a comprehensive tour of Oakidge Farm. He showed them his careful crop rotation system, explained his minimal intervention pest management approach, and demonstrated the irrigation setup that, while struggling with the drought, still represented a significant improvement over traditional methods in water efficiency. Throughout, David asked technical questions about soil health and water usage, while Alexandra seemed particularly interested in the varieties James grew and his reasons for selecting them. Even the children remained engaged, with Lucas asking thoughtful questions about the farm equipment and May delighting in discovering insects and smaller plants. When they reached the peach orchard, Alexandra paused, gazing up at the trees laden with ripening fruit. "These trees look quite mature." "Some are," James confirmed. "My grandfather planted the oldest ones. I've added new trees over the years to replace those that didn't survive, or to try different varieties." "You practice grafting?" David asked, examining a tree where different varieties clearly grew from the same trunk. James nodded. "I'm no expert, but I've had some success. That one has 3 varieties of peach on a single rootstock, allows me to extend the harvest season and try new types without planting entire new trees." David seemed impressed. "That's clever resource management." As they approached the greenhouse, James felt a momentary hesitation. This was his pride and joy, but also his biggest financial gamble. The high-efficiency structure had cost more than he could really afford, but it allowed year-round growing of certain crops, extending his selling season dramatically. "This is magnificent," Alexandra said, as they stepped inside the temperature-controlled space. Rows of seedlings and more mature plants grew in careful arrangement, with a sophisticated drip irrigation system delivering precise amounts of water to each. "It's my experiment in intensive growing," James explained. "Uses 90% less water than field cultivation for certain crops, and I can grow year-round, which helps with cash flow." David was examining the control panel that monitored temperature, humidity, and water delivery. "This is advanced technology for a small farm." "It was a big investment," James admitted. "Probably too big, given my current circumstances, but I believed it was the future of farming in drought conditions. Still do, actually. Alexandra was inspecting the seedlings with interest. What are you starting here? Those are rare pepper varieties for fall harvest. The restaurants in Lancaster go crazy for them. And over there are specialty greens that I can grow even in winter. Lucas had wandered over to a section where unusual-looking plants grew in special containers. What are these? They look weird. Experimental crops, James explained. I'm always trying new varieties that might be well adapted to our changing climate or that offer exceptional flavor. Those are a drought-resistant bean from the southwest. And those, he pointed to another section, are an heirloom tomato variety that was nearly extinct until a seed preservation group recovered it. You're a seed saver? Alexandra asked, her interest visibly piqued. James nodded. For certain varieties, yes. It's important work preserving genetic diversity, especially in food crops. Industrial agriculture has narrowed our food supply to just a few varieties of each plant. Selected for shipping durability and yield rather than flavor or nutrition, we're losing something valuable there. End quote. I couldn't agree more, Alexandra said with evident approval. By the time they completed the tour, returning to the farmhouse as the afternoon heat began to wane, James had revealed far more about his operation and his philosophy than he'd initially intended. There was something about the Chen's genuine interest that drew him out, making him speak openly about both his successes and his struggles. Would you all like some lemonade? He offered, as they reached the porch. Made with my own lemons, one of the greenhouse experiments. That sounds wonderful. Alexandra accepted for the family. Once they were settled on the porch with cool drinks, David leaned forward in his chair. James, I want to be direct. We're very impressed with what you've built here. Your growing methods align perfectly with our vision, and your commitment to heirloom varieties and sustainable practices is exactly what we're looking for in a partner. James took a careful sip of his lemonade. I appreciate that, but I'm still not clear on what exactly you're proposing. Alexandra set her glass down. We'd like to make a significant investment in Oakidge Farm to help you expand your heirloom crop production, particularly your greenhouse operation. In return, we'd establish a formal relationship where a portion of your harvest would be sold through our network to high-end restaurants and specialty markets at premium prices. What kind of investment are we talking about? James asked, trying to keep his tone neutral despite the hope flaring in his chest. David and Alexandra exchanged a glance before David answered. Based on what we've seen today, we're prepared to offer an initial investment of $500,000, with potential for additional funding based on performance and needs that emerge. In exchange, we'd ask for a minority partnership, stake 30%, and a commitment to maintain your sustainable practices while scaling up production of your specialty crops. End quote. James nearly choked on his lemonade. $500,000? It was more money than he'd ever imagined having access to. Enough to clear his debts, upgrade his equipment, expand the greenhouse, and still have operating capital for the coming year. But 30% ownership, that's substantial, he managed finally. What would that partnership look like in practice? Would you have input on day-to-day operations? Not at all, Alexandra assured him quickly. You know farming, we don't. We'd want quarterly meetings to discuss overall strategy and performance, and we'd expect adherence to certain quality standards and growing practices, though from what we've seen, you already exceed what we'd require. Day-to-day decisions would remain entirely yours. And the sales arrangement? David fielded this question. You'd commit to selling at least 60% of your specialty crop harvest through our network. We have relationships with restaurants in San Francisco, Los Angeles, and increasingly in other major cities, who are desperate for the kind of quality you produce. They pay premium prices, often 3 to 5 times what you might get at a farmer's market. The remaining 40% you could sell however you choose. James's mind was racing. On the surface, it sounded too good to be true, but he'd spent enough time with the Chens now to sense their sincerity. Still, caution was ingrained in him. I'd need to have my lawyer review any formal agreement, he said. And I'd want to speak with some of your existing farm partners, as Alexandra suggested. Of course, David nodded. We insist on proper legal review, and we can arrange calls with several of our partners. In fact, he pulled out his phone, checking something. Marcela Rivera of Sunshine Organic in Sonoma could speak with you as early as tomorrow. She was one of our first partners, and has been with the network for 3 years. We also have something else we'd like to show you, Alexandra added. She reached into her bag and extracted a sleek folder, which she handed to James. These are projections for Oakidge under the partnership, based on what we've observed today and your current production levels. James opened the folder to find professional-looking spreadsheets and charts. At a glance, the numbers were staggering, forecasting a revenue increase of over 200% within 3 years. These are just projections, of course, Alexandra cautioned, seeming to read his expression, but they're based on actual results from comparable farms in our network. James closed the folder, feeling slightly overwhelmed. I'll need time to review these properly and think about your offer. Absolutely, David agreed. This isn't a decision to rush. We're in the area for another week, so take the time you need. We can answer any questions that arise as you consider things. As the conversation shifted to lighter topics, James found himself watching the Chen children, who had finished their lemonade and were now exploring the porch. Lucas was examining an old set of hand tools that James had mounted on the wall as decoration, while May had discovered a praying mantis on the railing and was observing it with delighted concentration. There was something refreshing about seeing the farm through children's eyes, a reminder of the wonder he himself had felt growing up here. Before the weight of financial pressures and drought had dimmed that perspective, it made him think about legacy in a different way. Without children of his own, he'd always assumed Oakidge would end with him. But perhaps there was another kind of continuity possible through the preservation of growing methods, seed varieties, and a philosophy of stewardship rather than exploitation. Your children are welcome to collect some more peaches to take with you, he offered, watching May's gentle interaction with the insect. They seem to have enjoyed them. That's very kind, Alexandra smiled. They haven't stopped talking about those peaches. Lucas even refused dessert at dinner last night, saying it couldn't possibly compare. James felt an unexpected surge of pride. The simple pleasures are often the best. As the Chens prepared to leave an hour later, laden with a basket of peaches and other produce that James insisted they take, David lingered by the car for a private word. I sense you're still hesitant, he said quietly. That's understandable. But I want you to know that Alexandra and I didn't come to this region looking for you specifically. We stumbled upon Oakidge by chance, a fortunate accident of navigation. What we've found here exceeds our expectations in every way. James nodded, appreciating the man's directness. It's a lot to process. The offer is generous, more than generous, but Oakidge isn't just a business to me. We understand that, David assured him. That's precisely why we're interested. If it were just a business to you, the produce wouldn't be what it is, and the land wouldn't be cared for as it is. We're not looking to change Oakidge's soul, James. We want to secure its future. With that thought lingering in the air, the Chens departed, promising to be in touch the next day to arrange the call with Marcela Rivera. James stood in the driveway long after the dust from their car had settled, his mind swirling with possibilities he hadn't dared consider just days before. That evening, James sat at his kitchen table, the Chen's folder open before him, a legal pad covered in his handwriting beside it. He'd spent hours going over their projections, making his own calculations, listing questions and concerns. The financial logic was undeniable. Their proposal could transform Oakidge from a struggling operation into a thriving enterprise within years, maybe even months. But emotion tugged against logic. Generations of Harpers had farmed this land independently, answering to no one, taking on partners, even minority ones who promised not to interfere in daily operations, represented a fundamental change. Was he betraying his heritage by considering it? Or was he honoring it by ensuring the farm's survival? James pushed back from the table and walked to the window, gazing out at his land in the gathering darkness. The first stars were appearing, and a nearly full moon cast silver light across the fields. It was beautiful, peaceful, and terribly fragile. One more bad season, one major equipment failure, or an unexpected medical bill could be the final straw that broke Oakidge's back. The truth he'd been avoiding struck him with sudden clarity. Without some intervention, he would lose the farm. Not immediately, perhaps, but inevitably. The drought, the changing market conditions, the rise of corporate agriculture all were forces too powerful for him to fight alone, armed only with determination and tradition. Maybe, he thought, true stewardship meant recognizing when to adapt. His great-grandfather had adapted by transitioning from cattle to crops when the economics shifted. His grandfather had adapted by embracing BRAF, new irrigation techniques when consecutive dry years threatened yields. Perhaps this partnership was simply his generation's necessary adaptation. With that perspective settling in his mind, James returned to the table and pulled Alexandra's business card from his pocket. He didn't need to call. Now it was late, and this decision deserved the light of day. But for the first time, he was leaning toward saying, yes. The next morning, after completing essential farm tasks, James called the number on Alexandra's card. She answered on the second ring. James. She greeted him warmly. How are you today? Good morning, Alexandra. I'm well, thank you. I've been reviewing your proposal. And do you have questions for us? David and I are happy to discuss any aspect in more detail. I do have questions, James confirmed. But first, I'd like to take you up on the offer to speak with Marcela Rivera. I think hearing from one of your existing partners would be valuable. Of course. I spoke with her this morning, and she's expecting your call any time today. Would you prefer to speak by phone, or would a video call be better? She suggested the latter so she could show you some aspects of her operation. Video would be fine. James agreed, somewhat surprised at how prepared they were. It suggested a confidence in their existing partnerships that was reassuring. Alexandra provided contact details for Marcela, along with brief background information about Sunshine Organic. She's quite direct, Alexandra added with a hint of amusement. You'll get an honest assessment, no doubt about that. After thanking her and ending the call, James spent another hour on farm work before returning to the house to place the call to Marcela Rivera. He rarely used video calling and felt slightly self-conscious as he set up his laptop on the kitchen table, angling it to minimize the visibility of his worn surroundings. Marcela answered promptly, her face appearing on screen with a warm smile. She was an older woman with silver-streaked dark hair, deep laugh lines, and the weathered complexion of someone who spent significant time outdoors. James Harper, yes? Alexandra told me you'd be calling. I'm Marcela Rivera, owner of Sunshine Organic. Let me guess you're trying to decide whether these city slickers and their fancy business model are for real, or if they're just another bunch of vultures looking to pick the bones of a struggling farm. Her bluntness caught James off guard, but he found himself appreciating it. Something like that, he admitted with a slight smile. Marcela laughed. I had the same question 3 years ago. I was in worse shape than you are, from what Alexandra tells me, ready to auction off equipment and lease the land just to cover debts. No. Me show you something. She picked up her device and began walking, giving James a virtual tour of her farm. Sunshine Organic was smaller than Oakidge, but intensively cultivated, with gorgeous rows of vegetables, fruit trees, and several greenhouses similar to his own but larger. This is all certified organic, though we go beyond those standards, Marcela explained as she walked, specializing in berries, tree fruits, and heirloom tomatoes. These fields were nearly barren. 3 years ago, soil depleted, irrigation failing. The Chen investment changed everything. For the next hour, Marcela detailed her experience as a network partner, answering James's questions with refreshing candor. Yes, there were quarterly meetings to review performance and strategy. No, the Chens never interfered with her growing decisions beyond upholding the agreed-upon standards. Yes, the sales projections had been accurate. In fact, her revenue had exceeded the initial forecasts by nearly 20% in the second year. The part that surprised me most, Marcela said as she settled back in her office at the end of the tour, was how the relationship evolved. They started as investors, but they've become true partners. When we had that freak frost last spring that threatened the early berry crop, David was on the phone immediately, not asking about their returns but offering resources to mitigate the damage. When I developed that new grafting technique for the apple trees, Alexandra connected me with researchers at UC Davis who were interested in the same approach. James nodded thoughtfully. And the ownership structure? Has the 30% stake ever felt intrusive? Marcella shook her head firmly. Truthfully, I was worried about that at first. My family has farmed this land for generations too, but in practice, it's been liberating rather than constraining. Their stake gives them reason to ensure Sunshine succeeds, but the majority control stays with me. They've never voted against my recommendations at our formal meetings. Not once. By the end of the conversation, James felt both relieved and increasingly convinced. Marcella's experience aligned with what the Chens had described, and her transformation of a struggling farm into a thriving enterprise was compelling evidence of the partnership's potential. Thank you for being so open, he told her as they prepared to end the call. This has been incredibly helpful. One last thing, Marcella said, her expression turning serious. Whatever you decide, make it because it's right for your farm and your values. The Chens are good people with a vision I believe in, but only you know what's best for Oakidge. Trust your instincts, farmer to farmer. James carried that advice with him as he returned to his fields that afternoon. Trust your instincts. His instincts had led him to share produce with a stranded family when he could barely afford to feed himself. Those same instincts were now telling him that the Chen's offer represented not just financial salvation, but a path toward fulfilling Oakidge's true potential. Later that day, he called Alexandra again. I'd like to meet to discuss the partnership in more detail, he said, his decision made but not yet voiced explicitly. And I'd appreciate it if you could bring a draft of the formal agreement for my review. Of course, she responded, barely masking her pleased surprise. Would tomorrow afternoon work? We could come to the farm again, or meet in town if you prefer. The farm would be best. There are some specific areas I'd like to discuss expanding first if we move forward. If we move forward. The conditional phrase was a final hedge, a small protection against committing fully before seeing the detailed agreement. But in his heart, James had already crossed the threshold of decision. The next afternoon found the Chens once again at Oakidge, this time with a leather portfolio containing the partnership agreement. They gathered around the large oak table in James's dining room, a space rarely used since his parents' passing years ago. Before we get into the details, James began, I want to be clear about my priorities. If we do this, I accept your offer, certain aspects of Oakidge need to remain non-negotiable. Alexandra and David exchanged glances before David nodded. We're listening. First, the Harper name stays on the farm. No corporate rebranding. Second, I maintain complete control over growing methods, provided they meet or exceed the sustainability standards we agree upon. Third, I want a commitment that the land will never be sold for development, even if the partnership ends or if something happens to me. These weren't demands he'd planned in advance. They had emerged from his reflections over the past days, distillations of what mattered most to him about Oakidge's legacy. Those terms are entirely acceptable, Alexandra said without hesitation. In fact, they align perfectly with our own values for the network. We never rebrand our partner. Farms, their individual identity and reputation are crucial assets. And we're completely committed to agricultural preservation. We can include specific legal provisions to ensure the land remains in farming, regardless of future circumstances. James felt a weight lift from his shoulders. Then let's look at the agreement. For the next 2 hours, they went through the document paragraph by paragraph. The terms were largely as discussed. A $500,000 investment in exchange for a 30% partnership stake, with clear provisions for how decisions would be made, profits distributed, and future investments considered. David explained each section carefully, encouraging James to note any concerns or questions for his lawyer to address. There's one aspect we haven't discussed yet, Alexandra said as they neared the end of the review. The network functions not just as a sales channel, but as a collaborative community. Partners share knowledge, resources, and sometimes even equipment or staff during crucial periods. We organize annual gatherings where everyone comes together to learn from each other and from experts we bring in. It's completely optional, but most partners find it valuable. James considered this, He had always been somewhat isolated, partly by geography and partly by nature. The idea of being connected to other farmers with similar values and challenges was unexpectedly appealing. "Oh, that sounds interesting," he acknowledged. "I've never been much for conferences or networking events, but sharing practical knowledge with other farmers makes sense." "It's very informal," David assured him. "More like a community than a corporate function. The first one is actually next month in Sonoma. If we finalize this agreement soon, you'd be welcome to attend. No pressure. Just an opportunity to meet everyone." As they concluded the review, James felt a growing certainty about his decision. He would have his lawyer examine the agreement, of course, but barring any unforeseen issues, he was ready to accept the partnership. "Assuming my lawyer doesn't find any problems, how quickly could we proceed?" he asked. "The timing is important for planning fall planting and potential greenhouse expansion before winter." "We could close within 2 weeks," David replied. "Funds would be available immediately thereafter. We understand agricultural timing constraints and can expedite our normal process if needed." James nodded, a plan already forming in his mind for how to allocate the investment. First priority would be clearing the bank loans that had been hanging over him, followed by critical equipment repairs and upgrades. The greenhouse expansion would come next, allowing for increased winter production, and finally, improved water management systems to maximize efficiency during drought conditions. "I think we have the foundation for an agreement," he said finally. "I'll have my lawyer review this early next week and get back to you with any adjustments." Alexandra smiled, her usual reserve giving way to genuine pleasure. "We're thrilled, James. Truly, Oakidge will be an exceptional addition to the network." As they prepared to leave, May approached James shyly, holding another origami creation, this time a delicate flower. "I made this for your windowsill too," she said, offering it to him. "It's a lotus. My grandmother taught me how to make them." James accepted it carefully. "It's beautiful, May. Thank you. I'll put it right next to your crane." The child beamed, then added with surprising perception, "I'm glad you're going to be partners with my parents. Your peaches make people happy." Her simple assessment struck James as perhaps the most fundamental truth about farming: growing food that nourishes and brings joy to others. In all the financial struggles and technical discussions, it was easy to lose sight of that essential purpose. "That's what we try to do," he agreed. "Grow things that make people happy." After the Chens departed, James stood on his porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and pink. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to look at his farm not with anxiety about its survival, but with excitement for its future. The partnership with Chen Innovations wouldn't solve every problem or eliminate all challenges, but it offered something he had been losing gradually with each difficult season: hope. The following 2 weeks passed in a whirlwind of activity. James's lawyer, a childhood friend who specialized in agricultural law, reviewed the agreement, suggesting minor modifications that the Chens readily accepted. The local bank manager, who had been increasingly stern in recent meetings, was barely able to conceal his shock when James announced he would be paying off all outstanding loans in full. And throughout, James continued the daily work of the farm with renewed energy, already planning expansions and improvements. On a warm Tuesday morning, James sat at his kitchen table with Alexandra, David, and 2 notaries, signing the finalized partnership agreement. The moment felt both monumental and strangely ordinary. A few signatures on paper that represented a fundamental shift in Oakidge's trajectory. "Congratulations, partners," David said warmly as they completed the process, extending his hand to James. James shook it firmly, still adjusting to the concept. "Thank you, both of you, for seeing potential here that others missed." "We didn't miss it," Alexandra corrected gently. "We were just fortunate enough to experience it firsthand when our GPS led us astray. Sometimes getting lost is the best way to find something valuable." The funds were transferred that afternoon, a surreal experience for James. Watching his bank balance transform from precarious to substantial in an instant. Following a plan they had developed together, he immediately paid off the farm's debts, ordered crucial equipment repairs, and contracted Dow for the greenhouse expansion, which could begin as early as the following week. True to their word, the Chens maintained a respectful distance from daily operations, while making themselves available for consultation whenever James reached out with questions. Their expertise in marketing and distribution proved invaluable as they began integrating Oakidge's products into their network, securing commitments from high-end restaurants that had previously been inaccessible to a small farm like his. The first significant test of the new partnership came a month later, when an unexpected equipment failure threatened to compromise irrigation during a critical growth period. In the past, such a crisis would have meant desperate measures, perhaps borrowing money at exorbitant rates or watching crops wither while waiting for repairs. Instead, one call to David resulted in an emergency replacement part being flown in from San Francisco and installed within 24 hours, saving thousands of dollars in potential crop losses. "That's what partners do," David said simply when James tried to express his gratitude. "Your success is our success now." As summer transitioned to fall, James found himself adjusting to a new reality, one where financial pressures no longer dominated every decision, where planning could extend beyond mere survival to genuine improvement and innovation. The expanded greenhouse was completed ahead of schedule, doubling his capacity for winter growing. Soil amendments and improved irrigation were already showing results in crop health and yield, and perhaps most significantly, he had hired 2 full-time employees, local people with agricultural experience, who shared his commitment to quality and sustainability. In October, somewhat to his own surprise, James accepted the Chen's invitation to attend the network partners gathering in Sonoma. It would be his first time leading the farm for more than a day in years, a concept that would have been unthinkable before the partnership made reliable help possible. Arriving at Sunshine Organic, he was greeted warmly by Marcela Rivera, who seemed pleased but not surprised by the transformation the partnership had already begun at Oakidge. "You're looking less haunted," she observed with characteristic directness as she showed him to a guest cabin on her property. "It suits you." "How's the new greenhouse performing?" "Beyond expectations," James admitted. "We're on track to triple winter production, and the efficiency improvements have reduced water usage by nearly 40%. "I should have done this years ago." Marcella shook her head. "You couldn't have done it years ago. That's the point of this network, making possible what small farms could never accomplish alone." The gathering itself proved to be nothing like the corporate networking events James had dreaded. Instead, it felt more like a family reunion of people who shared common values and challenges. Farmers from across the West Coast shared knowledge, celebrated successes, problem-solved difficulties, and formed connections that transcended business relationships. On the final evening, during a harvest dinner featuring products from all the partner farms, Alexandra stood to make a toast. James was startled to find his own heirloom tomatoes and peppers featured prominently in several dishes, their vibrant colors and flavors drawing enthusiastic compliments from chefs and farmers alike. "To all of you who grow the exceptional food on these tables," Alexandra raised her glass. "Thank you for your partnership, your knowledge, and your commitment to preserving agricultural traditions that might otherwise be lost. And a special welcome to our newest partner, James Harper of Oakidge Farm, whose extraordinary produce you've been enjoying tonight." The warm applause that followed was a new experience for James, who had spent his farming career largely invisible to the end consumers of his products. There was validation in this recognition, not of his ego, but of the work itself, work that had been undervalued for too long. Later that night, sitting around a fire pit with several other farmers and a few of the network's restaurant partners, James found himself sharing stories and laughing more freely than he had in years. The chef from a renowned San Francisco restaurant described with passionate detail how he had built an entire menu around James's rare bell pepper varieties, creating a waiting list of customers eager to experience them. "It's a different relationship with food," the chef explained. "When I know the farmer, when I understand how and why certain varieties are grown, it transforms my approach to cooking, and that translates to the diner's experience. It's not just consumption, it's connection." James nodded, recognizing a parallel to his own feeling about farming. It's never been just about production for me either. There's I don't know, a dialogue with the land. You listen to what it needs, what it can support. You adapt and respond, rather than simply imposing your will. That's exactly it, the chef agreed enthusiastically. And customers are hungry for that authenticity, that relationship with their food. They want to know someone cared about every step of its journey to their plate. As the conversation continued, James realized that in joining the network, he had found not just financial stability, but a community that valued what he had always valued, a deeper, more mindful relationship with food and the land that produces it. It was a perspective that had been difficult to maintain in isolation, ground down by economic pressures and practical necessities. Now, surrounded by others who shared and reinforced these values, he felt his original passion for farming rekindling. Returning to Oakidge after the gathering, James brought with him not just new techniques and connections, but a renewed sense of purpose. The farm was still fundamentally the same place, the land his ancestors had worked, the home he had always known, but his relationship to it had evolved. It was no longer a burden he carried alone, but a shared vision with partners who respected its unique character and history. Throughout the fall and into winter, the partnership continued to prove its value. The expanded greenhouse production found ready markets through the network, providing steady income during what had traditionally been lean months. James implemented several innovations learned from other partner farms, while sharing his own expertise in drought-resistant growing techniques. And gradually, Oakidge began to reclaim its place as one of the region's premier small farms, not through growth and acreage, but through excellence in quality and sustainability. A year after the chance encounter with the Chen family, James stood in his fields on a crisp spring morning, surveying the transformation. New irrigation systems gleamed in the early light. Cover crops nourished soil that had been depleted for years. Young fruit trees, grafted with heritage varieties, promised future harvests. And perhaps most significantly, local employees moved among the rows, their presence ensuring that the work of the farm no longer depended solely on his increasingly tired body. As he walked back toward the farmhouse, he noticed a now familiar black SUV coming up the driveway. The Chens had called yesterday to say they'd be stopping by with news, though they hadn't specified what kind. James felt a momentary tension. A year into the partnership, he still occasionally worried about increased corporate influence, but it dissipated quickly. They had proven themselves true to their word, in every respect so far. Alexandra and David emerged from the vehicle, followed by the children, who had grown noticeably in the past year. May, in particular, had shot up several inches, though her shy smile remained the same as she waved to James. "Good morning," James called, meeting them by the recently repaired front steps. "You're just in time. The first strawberries of the season are ready for tasting." Lucas's eyes lit up. "Really? Are they as good as your peaches?" James laughed. "Different, but special in their own way. We can go pick some after I've heard what brings you all out here today." They settled on the porch, which had received a fresh coat of paint over the winter. The origami crane and lotus flowers still occupied places of honor on the windowsill, joined now by several other creations May had sent over the months. "We have something exciting to share," Alexandra began once they were seated. "The network has attracted significant attention in culinary and sustainability circles. A major food publication is planning a feature on our model, highlighting the way it preserves small farms while connecting them to markets that value quality over quantity." End quote. "That's wonderful," James acknowledged, genuinely pleased for the recognition of their shared vision. "They want to feature 3 farms in depth," David continued. "And they've specifically requested Oakidge as one of them, after a chef in San Francisco raved about your heirloom varieties." James blinked in surprise. "My farm? Why not one of the more established partners?" "Because your story illustrates the core purpose of the network," Alexandra explained. "A multi-generational farm preserved through partnership rather than lost to development or corporate agriculture. Plus," she added with a smile, "everyone agrees your produce is exceptional, even among our partners. The writer and a photographer would like to visit next month," David added. "They're interested in not just the current operation but the history of Oakidge, your family's legacy here." James felt a complex mix of emotions. Pride in the recognition, certainly, but also a momentary hesitation about such public exposure. He had always been a private person, content to let his produce speak for itself. "You don't have to decide immediately," Alexandra assured him, seeming to read his uncertainty. "They'll only come if you're comfortable with it." James nodded appreciatively, then surprised himself with his response. "No, it's a good thing. Not for me personally, but for what we're trying to accomplish together. If our story helps other small farms find a sustainable path forward, that matters more than my privacy." David smiled, clearly pleased. "That's exactly how we see it too. But that's not the only reason for our visit," Alexandra added, reaching into her bag. "We've brought something else to discuss." She handed James a folder similar to the one that had contained the original partnership proposal a year ago. Inside, James found detailed plans for a seed preservation and agricultural education center to be built on a currently unused corner of Oakidge Farm. The proposed facility would serve multiple purposes: preserving heirloom seed varieties, hosting workshops for local farmers and gardeners, providing educational opportunities for schools, and serving as a hub for sustainable agriculture research. This would be a separate entity from the farm itself, David explained as James reviewed the plans. "A non-profit organization with its own funding and governance, though obviously complementary to Oakidge's mission. We'd like to provide the initial funding and help establish partnerships with universities and conservation organizations." "Why here?" James asked, though he was already intrigued by the concept. "Several reasons," Alexandra replied. "Your location is accessible, but still authentically rural. Oakidge already grows numerous heirloom varieties that could form the nucleus of a seed bank, and frankly, your knowledge and approach to farming would be invaluable to the educational component." End quote. "We're not asking you to run it," David clarified quickly. "We'd hire a dedicated staff for day-to-day operations. But your involvement, to whatever degree you're comfortable with, would add tremendous value." James studied the plans more carefully. The proposed center was thoughtfully designed to harmonize with the farm's existing architecture and landscape. Its mission aligned perfectly with values he'd held his entire farming career. And the educational aspect offered a way to share knowledge that might otherwise die with him, given his lack of direct heirs. "This could create jobs in the community," he observed, "and preserve agricultural knowledge that's being lost with each passing generation." "Exactly," Alexandra nodded enthusiastically. "It's not just about saving seeds, but about saving the cultural and practical knowledge of how to grow them successfully." "What would you need from me?" James asked, his mind already moving beyond the question of whether to accept the proposal to the practicalities of implementation. "Land use permission for the facility site, input on the design and programming, and whatever level of participation in the educational aspects you're willing to offer," David explained. "We'd handle funding, construction, staffing, and ongoing operations." They discussed the details for another hour, with James offering suggestions based on his knowledge of the local community and agricultural needs. By the time the conversation concluded, the concept had evolved from the Chen's initial proposal to a truly collaborative vision that excited all of them. "I think this could be something special," James acknowledged. "Not just for Oakidge, but for the entire region." "We think so too," Alexandra agreed. "And it feels like a natural evolution of what we started a year ago, preserving not just the farm, but the knowledge and traditions that make it valuable." As promised, they concluded the meeting with a visit to the strawberry patch, where Lucas and May delighted in picking and eating the season's first berries, their fingers and lips stained red with juice. James watched them with amusement, reminded of his own childhood experiences of discovery and wonder on the farm. Later, after the Chens had departed with promises to develop more detailed plans for the education center, James walked his fields alone, as was his evening habit. The setting sun cast long shadows across land that had been in his family for generations, land that, a year ago, he had been in danger of losing. Now, not only was Oakidge secure, but it was thriving in ways he couldn't have imagined. The partnership with the Chens had preserved the farm's independence while connecting it to a broader community of shared values. The proposed education center would extend its impact beyond production alone. ensuring that the knowledge accumulated over generations would continue to serve others. James paused at the edge of the peach orchard, where new grafts were taking hold on established trees. Perfect metaphor, he thought, for what had happened with the farm itself. The roots and foundation remained, drawing strength from deep connections to the land and its history. But new growth had been carefully integrated, bringing vitality and ensuring future harvests. He remembered the desperate prayer he had uttered in these same fields a year ago. Just hold on another month. The universe had answered with something far beyond mere survival, offering instead a path to genuine renewal. As night fell, stars appearing in a clear sky above fields that would feed people he would never meet, James Harper felt something he recognized from childhood, but had almost forgotten. The simple, profound satisfaction of being exactly where he belonged, doing work that mattered, as part of something larger than himself. The chance encounter with a family stranded by the roadside had transformed not just the financial reality of Oakidge Farm, but his relationship to it. What had been a burden had become a blessing once again. What had been isolation had become connection. And what had seemed like an ending had become, instead, a new beginning. 6 months later, construction began on the Heritage Seeds Agricultural Education Center at Oakidge Farm. The groundbreaking ceremony brought together local farmers, educators, conservation specialists, and all 12 of the Chen Innovation Network's partner farms. James, unaccustomed to public speaking, nevertheless found himself addressing the gathered crowd with unexpected eloquence. Farming has always been about the future, he told them, standing before the ceremonial shovel. We plant seeds today for harvests we hope to see tomorrow. This center represents that same spirit, preserving the best of our agricultural heritage to nourish generations to come. As he turned the first ceremonial spade of earth, James caught Alexandra's eye in the crowd. She nodded slightly, a gesture of shared understanding between partners who had begun as strangers but had found common ground in the most literal sense. Later, as the gathering transitioned to a celebration featuring food grown at network farms, including abundant produce from Oakidge, James found himself approached by a local farmer he knew only slightly, an older man, who had seemed skeptical when the partnership with Chen Innovations was first announced. "Had you pegged wrong, Harper?" the man admitted gruffly. "Thought you were selling out to city folks who'd turn this into another hobby farm. But what you've done here, it's good. Keeping the real farming alive, just making it viable again." James nodded, understanding both the initial suspicion and the hard-won approval. "Change isn't always bad, just different. I'm still growing the same crops, just with better resources now. And teaching others," the man added, gesturing toward a group of agricultural students from the state university who had come for the groundbreaking. "That matters. Too many old ways being lost." The observation stayed with James throughout the evening, teaching others, preserving knowledge, creating continuity. These were aspects of legacy he had never considered when thinking about Oakidge's future. Without children of his own to pass the farm to, he had assumed its story would end with him. Now, he was beginning to see a different kind of succession, one based on shared values and knowledge rather than bloodlines. The education center took shape over the following months, its construction carefully scheduled to minimize disruption to farm operations. By the next spring, the main building was complete, a beautiful timber frame structure that seemed to have grown organically from the landscape. Inside were classroom spaces, seed storage facilities, a test kitchen for culinary education, and an agricultural library stocked with both modern resources and historical farming journals, including those kept by James's grandfather and great-grandfather. The center's opening coincided with the second anniversary of James's partnership with the Chens, a coincidence that felt appropriate, the fulfillment of possibilities set in motion by that initial agreement. The event drew significant attention, with agricultural publications covering it alongside food writers and sustainability advocates. James, still uncomfortable with publicity, nevertheless recognized its value in spreading their message. "This might be the first center of its kind in our region, but we hope it won't be the last," he told a reporter from a national farming magazine. "Every agricultural area has unique knowledge worth preserving and sharing." As the center began operations, James found himself gradually drawn into its educational mission, despite his initial reluctance. What began as occasional contributions to workshops evolved into a regular teaching role, with James leading sessions on drought-resistant growing techniques, soil health management, and the cultivation of heirloom varieties. To his surprise, he discovered a talent for teaching his practical knowledge and straightforward communication style, resonating especially with beginning farmers who were hungry for real-world expertise rather than craft textbook theories. Working with these younger agriculturalists rekindled his own enthusiasm, their questions pushing him to articulate knowledge he had absorbed so gradually that he had never consciously formulated it. "You've become quite the professor," Alexandra teased during one of their quarterly partnership meetings, after observing one of his workshops. "The students hang on your every word." James shrugged, embarrassed but pleased. "I'm just answering their questions. They do most of the work themselves." "Don't underestimate the impact you're having," David said more seriously. "Several of those students have told us they changed their career plans because of your classes choosing small-scale sustainable agriculture over corporate farming or non-agricultural paths." The education center flourished, quickly becoming a regional hub for sustainable farming practices. Its seed bank grew as local farmers contributed heirloom varieties, many of which had been preserved in family collections for generations without formal documentation. These were now carefully cataloged, their growing requirements and characteristics recorded for future farmers. Meanwhile, Oakidge Farm itself continued to thrive under the partnership. The expanded greenhouse operation provided year-round income, while field crops benefited from improved irrigation and soil management practices. James had hired several full-time employees now, including a farm manager who shared his philosophy and could oversee daily operations when he was teaching or consulting with other network farms. 3 years into the partnership, during a warm summer evening reminiscent of the day they had first met, the Chen family joined James for dinner at the farmhouse. Such gatherings had become a tradition whenever they visited the region, though this was their first in several months due to travel commitments. The children, no longer quite children, Lucas was now 15. May 13 had grown dramatically since their first encounter. Lucas had developed an interest in agricultural technology and was eagerly telling James about new irrigation monitoring systems, while May, still artistic, had expanded her origami skills to botanical illustration and was showing Alexandra her sketches of unique seed varieties from the center's collection. After dinner, as they enjoyed peaches from the orchard on the porch, David broached a new subject. "James, we've been giving a lot of thought to the next phase of the network's development," he began. "The first phase was about establishing partnerships with exceptional farms like Oakidge. The second was creating educational resources like the center here. Now we're considering how to address another critical issue: land access for new farmers." Alexandra took up the thread. "The average age of farmers nationally is approaching 60, and many have no succession plan. Meanwhile, young people interested in sustainable agriculture can't afford land, especially near urban markets. We're exploring the creation of a land trust that would acquire at-risk farmland and make it available to qualified new farmers through long-term, affordable leases." James nodded thoughtfully, immediately seeing the logic. The biggest barrier for young farmers is land cost. Even if they have the skills and passion, they can't compete with development prices. "Exactly," David agreed. "Our concept would involve donors and impact investors providing capital to purchase farmland that might otherwise be developed, then establishing lease arrangements that give new farmers security while keeping the land in agricultural use permanently." End quote. "We'd like to pilot the program in this region," Alexandra added. "And we're hoping you might consider serving as an advisor, particularly in evaluating potential new farmers. Your experience with the educational programs has given you unique insight into who has both the technical skills and the character needed to succeed." James was silent for a moment, turning the concept over in his mind. It was ambitious, but addressed a real need he saw daily in his work with younger agriculturalists. "It makes sense," he said finally. "A natural evolution from what we've already built. And the need is certainly there. We thought you'd understand," David smiled. "The details still need development, but the core concept is to create a pathway for land transition that serves everyone: retiring farmers who get fair value, new farmers who gain access, and communities that, quote, keep working agricultural landscapes. As the conversation continued, exploring various aspects of the proposed land trust, James felt a growing sense of purpose. What had begun as a simple act of kindness offering produce to a stranded family had catalyzed a transformation that extended far beyond Oakidge Farm. The partnership had preserved not just his land, but his ability to farm it according to his values. The education center was ensuring those values and knowledge would outlive him. And now, this new initiative offered the possibility of creating opportunities for others to follow a similar path. Later that night, after the Chens had departed for their hotel in Lancaster, James stood on his porch gazing at fields silvered by moonlight. His grandfather had often told him that farming was an act of faith, planting seeds with no guarantee they would grow, trusting in processes you could influence but never fully control. The partnership had been such an act of faith, a seed planted in uncertainty that had grown into something he could never have envisioned. The following morning, James awoke to the familiar sounds of farm activity: workers arriving, equipment starting up, the rhythm of a working day beginning. But rather than immediately joining the activity, as had been his habit for decades, he allowed himself a few minutes of reflection. At 46, he was still relatively young for a farmer, with many productive years ahead. But for the first time, he was thinking seriously about legacy, in a broader sense than mere survival or continuation. What would Oakidge represent in the community 50 years from now? How would the knowledge he had accumulated be preserved and adapted for future conditions? What impact might the educational center, and now potentially the land trust, have on the region's agricultural character? These were questions he had never had the luxury to consider during the desperate years of merely trying to keep the farm afloat. They represented a profound shift from reacting to thriving, from isolation to engagement with a larger community and purpose. When he finally did join the day's activities, it was with renewed energy and a clearer sense of purpose. The partnership with the Chens had begun as a financial necessity, but had evolved into something far more meaningful: a shared vision for agriculture that honored tradition while embracing necessary innovation. Over the next year, the land trust concept moved from idea to implementation. A legal structure was established, initial funding secured, and criteria developed for both land acquisition and farmer selection. James found himself deeply involved in the process, his practical knowledge complementing the Chen's organizational and financial expertise. The first property acquired by the trust was a 40-acre farm adjacent to Oakidge, owned by an elderly couple with no children interested in continuing the operation. Rather than selling to developers, they chose to work with the trust, securing their retirement while ensuring the land they loved would remain in agricultural use. After careful consideration of several applicants, the trust selected a young couple, graduates of the Education Center's intensive program, to lease the property. Maria and Jack Rodriguez brought complementary skills to their new venture, she with formal agricultural training and experience in specialty crop production, he with marketing background and mechanical aptitude. Most importantly, they shared the philosophy of stewardship and quality that the trust sought to perpetuate. James found himself serving as an informal mentor to the young farmers, available for consultation without interference. Watching them apply contemporary techniques to time-tested principles gave him a new perspective on his own operation. Their enthusiasm reminded him of his younger self, while their willingness to experiment with new approaches challenged him to reconsider some of his own established practices. 5 years after the roadside encounter that had changed everything, Oakidge Farm hosted a regional gathering of sustainable agriculture practitioners. The event brought together partner farms from the Chen network, graduates of the Education Center, farmers established through the Land Trust, local food producers, chefs, and agricultural educators. Standing on a makeshift stage before the assembled crowd, James found himself reflecting on the journey that had led to this moment. 5 years ago, he began, I was a farmer at the end of his rope, facing the very real possibility of losing land that had been in my family for generations. Today, we gather on that same land to celebrate not just its survival, but its role in a broader movement toward agricultural renewal. End quote. He gestured toward the thriving fields visible behind the gathering. What you see around you isn't just the work of one farmer anymore. It's the result of partnership, of shared purpose, of the recognition that we're stronger together than alone. James acknowledged the Chens, seated in the front row beside their now nearly adult children. A chance encounter brought the Chen family to Oakidge actually. A GPS error. This prompted knowing laughter from the crowd. But what could have been a brief interaction became the foundation for everything we've built together since. He spoke of the network of farms, the education center, the land trust, each initiative building on the one before, creating an integrated approach to agricultural sustainability that honored tradition while embracing necessary change. What began with one struggling farm has grown into a movement that now encompasses 23 working farms, an education center that has trained over 200 new farmers, and a land trust that has preserved 8 properties totaling nearly 600 acres. James summarized. And we're just getting started. As the event continued into the evening, with tables set up among the apple trees for a harvest dinner featuring produce from all the participating farms, James found a quiet moment with Alexandra and David. May, now a poised young woman of 18 preparing for college, was deep in conversation with Maria Rodriguez about a rare bean variety they were collaborating to preserve. Lucas, 20, and studying agricultural engineering, was demonstrating a water monitoring device he had helped develop to a group of interested farmers. "Did you ever imagine this?" James asked the Chens, gesturing to the gathering. "When your GPS sent you down that county road 5 years ago?" Alexandra smiled, shaking her head. "We were simply looking for partners who shared our values. We found that and so much more in you and Oakidge. The scale of what's developed has exceeded our expectations," David acknowledged. "But the spirit of it, that's exactly what we hoped for. A community of like-minded people working toward a common goal of agricultural sustainability and excellence." James nodded, watching as twilight settled over the farm, string lights illuminating the tables where people from all aspects of the food system shared meals and conversation. "My grandfather used to say that a farm is never just about the current season's crop. It's about building soil, planting trees whose shade you might never sit under, creating something that outlasts you." "A beautiful perspective," Alexandra said softly. "I never fully understood it until recently," James admitted. "I was too caught up in survival to see beyond the immediate challenges. You helped change that helped me lift my gaze from the immediate to the possible." As night fell completely, the gathering showed no signs of disbanding, the conversation and laughter continuing under stars and string lights. James excused himself briefly, walking to a quiet spot at the edge of the orchard where he could observe the scene from a slight distance. From here, he could see the farmhouse where generations of Harpers had lived, the barn that had sheltered equipment through countless seasons, the fields that had produced food for thousands of people over the decades. These physical elements remained, their continuity preserved through the partnership that had saved the farm from financial collapse. But he could also see the new additions: the education center with its modern classroom facilities and seed bank, the expanded greenhouses gleaming in the moonlight, the adjacent farm now operated by the Rodriguez family through the land trust. And most significantly, he could see the people diverse in age, background, and role, but united by a shared commitment to agricultural values that transcended individual interests. Oakidge had transformed from a solitary endeavor, isolated by both geography and economic pressure, into a hub of community activity and shared purpose. The farm had always been his anchor, the place that defined him. Now it had become something more, a catalyst for change that extended far beyond its boundaries. James thought back to that desperate summer day, the unexpected arrival of a family seeking directions, the simple act of sharing what little he had with strangers. He could never have anticipated where that moment would lead: the partnership, the renewal of Oakidge, the expanding initiatives that now touched so many lives. As he rejoined the gathering, taking a seat between David Chen and Maria Rodriguez as they discussed potential new varieties for the coming growing season, James Harper felt a profound sense of fulfillment. The struggling farm had not merely survived, it had found new purpose as part of something larger than itself. And so had he. in the soft evening light, with the legacy of the past preserved and the promise of the future taking shape around him. James recognized that the most valuable harvest of all had not come from his fields, but from the connections, purpose, and community that had grown from one simple act of generosity on a hot summer day. The farm would continue, though in ways his ancestors could never have imagined. The knowledge would endure, passed not just through family lines, but through institutional structures designed for broad impact. And the values stewardship, quality, sustainability would spread through an ever-widening network of people committed to an agriculture that nourished both land and community. For a farmer, there could be no greater legacy. For James Harper, there could be no greater satisfaction than knowing that the seeds he had planted, both literally and figuratively, would continue to bear fruit long after his own season had passed.